humans are, in fact, by far the most studied species on this planet, a lot of animal research is, of course, actually research that is being conducted for its use in extrapolating to the human population. For example, behavioral studies, even psychological studies, are often performed on animals, and again, the results of those studies are extrapolated for their relevance to the human population. And in fact, there is an entire field of study that people may not be able to name, but ethology, which is the study of animal behavior, which, again, is often used to make comments on humans. And one particular experiment, I note, has gained a great degree of infamy or popularity or whatever it is online specifically in the last few years, and I'm not exactly sure why in the last few years, but I'm sure all of you have by this point heard of the Mouse Utopia experiments conducted by John B. Calhoun, working for the National Institute of Mental Health.
2.5 years ago, we found Dr. John Calhoun knee-deep in mice in the mouse heaven he designed for the National Institute of Mental Health Animal Center near Washington. Dr. Calhoun wanted to find out what would happen to a mouse colony given everything mice need except living space. The result was chilling. 2.5 years ago, more than 2,000 mice were packed into Mouse City. Today, a tiny handful of survivors huddles in one corner of the city. Dr. Calhoun explains what the overcrowding did to Mouse City's inhabitants.
The last 1,000 animals born never learned to develop the social behaviors. They never learned to be aggressive, which is necessary in defense of home sites. They never learned to court. There was no mating. Being no mating, there were no progeny, and the older animals whose behavior was already becoming disrupted, they eventually reached an age too old to reproduce, and so it was all left up to these last 1,000 or so, whom we call the beautiful ones, because not engaging in any stressful activity and only paying attention to themselves, they groomed themselves well, so they looked very fine specimens. But from that point on, which was about the time that you were here 2.5 years ago, this reproduction totally ceased, and the animals have just aged and died.
Let's go one layer deeper, because it strikes me that there is obviously a lot to learn there about these experiments and the way they propagate through the population. Not only the articles and different resources that they brought up live on air there, but also one that was referenced, although I don't believe they actually looked at it in particular, the Fee.org article, John P. Calhoun's Mouse Utopia Experiment and Reflections on the Welfare State. And there are many different ways that you can approach this experiment and look at what its deeper implications are. But I think when we do so, we also have to be conscious of a particular piece of propaganda that's embedded in the very concept of ethology and in this experiment in particular, and all of the ways that all of these people are examining it, which is namely that we take at face value what is clearly embedded within this experiment, which is that this experiment is not about mice or how best to regulate mouse populations. I mean, of course, this isn't ultimately about mice. This is about humans.
At least one human group, the Eat tribe, discovered in Africa by Dr. Colin Turnbull, has gone through a similar terrible process, according to Dr. Calhoun.
The two conditions that they went through was that there was a decision on the then colonial government to make a wildlife preserve of this big valley, which was their home with their hunter-gatherers. They were moved up onto the mountainside and gathered together in much higher density. Instead of being spread out in small groups, they were all placed in one place, and also required to engage in an entirely different way of life, in which their social roles, everything they learned how to do had no meaning. Under those conditions, the social behavior broke down entirely. They began living. They still lived together, but their activities were just directed towards themselves. Everything you would think that's human disappeared.
Perhaps the most chilling conclusion from his Mouse City studies, says Dr. Calhoun, is that once this change in social behavior occurs, it apparently cannot be reversed.
It's this fact of apparent irreversible phase shifts that gives some of us a particular concern over the fate of the human situation, because we see worldwide the breaking down of social roles, the increase in contact as a result of the breakdown of the social roles and because there are too many people, that this might lead to an overriding of our controls, of our total culture, and would be set into a process which would either fix us rigidly forever into some sort of global tribalism without any adaptation to change, or that would result perhaps eventually some decline, very much like we've seen here, but that postponed somewhat.
Dr. John B. Calhoun, with a very sobering look at a possible future for us. Bill Roberts from the National Institute of Mental Health Animal Center near Washington.
Yes, you don't have to go very far to find out the truth that these experiments, of course, are not about the animals. They are about the human population and how the lessons of these experiments can be applied to the human population, either to provide for the flourishing of the human population or to provide for its disintegration.
Though these studies use animals, the findings about population growth and individual behavior are being closely compared to our own human population.
Doctor, what do you think now of the stress on environmental problems, trying to solve them? Should government, the politicians, pay more attention to this problem, do you think? They're all interlaced. It isn't that simple, but...
Well, the problem, the environment is just one problem which we're focused on now, and this may be a real trap because we only look at the physical, biological aspects of our surroundings, whereas if we focused instead on what is a much more essential, comprehensive problem, and this is evolution and the designing of evolution. And in fact, we like to say that we are revolutionists here, but a particular kind of revolutionist, but you now spell differently. Now, we all know what this symbol is. This is prescription. Yes. But, so we're concerned with the prescription for evolution, or the design of the future, the design of evolution. So we're revolutionists.
Similarly, looking at mouse utopias or dystopias, when we think about how that can or should be applied to the human population, can either be used as a warning, well, we should try to do this in order to make the human population flourish, or it could be used, of course, offensively against the human population. If you want to make a human society disintegrate, well, just do this, guys. And again, we don't have to go very far to see that this, of course, is not about mice. It is about people. We can go to John B. Calhoun himself, who wrote an article in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Medicine in January of 1973 about his research called Death Squared, The Explosive Growth and Demise of a Mouse Population, where he wrote, "I shall largely speak of mice, but my thoughts are on man, on healing, on life and its evolution. Threatening life and evolution are the two deaths, death of the spirit and death of the body. Evolution, in terms of ancient wisdom, is the acquisition of access to the tree of life." What is the point? What is actually being said here, and what should we take away from it? Well, again, this is where we can look at, are we being engineered into some sort of mouse dystopia in order to better control the human population and make it go in a certain way? And there's a very specific way in which we can look at that by actually literalizing the metaphor of the mouse utopia. Well, this mouse utopia is like the human population, and we can see what happens there, and we can compare it to how humans act. But actually, let's take the whole experimental setup and say that that's the metaphor upon which we're working, in which there is an experimenter who is looking down and crafting this experimental space that has these conditions and these certain ways of being constructed that will lead to this type of flourishing of the population or this type of disintegration of the population. And they are looking at the ways that this happens and then can use that to create another experiment where presumably you could do the same thing with a different batch of mice and get the same results. So we can now use this as a method. Well, okay, let's not just look at the mice in this, let's look at the experimenter and the setup of the experiment. And you see, well, if we could engineer the human species into a situation where they similarly have their material wants and needs taken care of, and the only limitation is on their space, well, will they start to disintegrate this way? Well, can we literalize that metaphor? Is that happening in actuality? And yes, I would say it is. In fact, this is how we need to be reading all of this woolly, fluffy, wonderful rhetoric about sustainable development. Sustainable development sounds so wonderful. We only care about the environment. We just want to go in and make sure all these spaces, this lush abundance of the natural world is taken care of for future generations. Don't you want that? Yes, I do want that. Okay, then all we have to do is set up these multilateral organizations, these international bodies like the World Wildlife Federation, will come in and lovingly appropriate these areas from the people who are living on them and use those resources wisely for the benefit of the literal card-carrying eugenicists who found these organizations, the debt for nature swaps that are increasingly being used and going to be used going forward from here through organizations in order to monopolized vast swaths of the earth and the natural abundance of the earth, crowd people into highly controlled, packed urban areas where, like that mouse experiment, it's an artificially created tiny space that gives the impression, the general impression of overcrowding. And so people start to internalize, oh, the world is overpopulated, and we all have to retreat into our little bubble that we can find in here and preen ourselves, or unbreed ourselves into extinction. So, yes, there are some very interesting ways that this experiment can be looked at. Essentially, we are a herd of cattle or of mice, whatever, take your pick. And the overpopulation problem is going to create all these problems. So we have to find responsible ways for keeping that in line. And that's why over and over and over, this is what it goes back to. No surprise. It's always at the heart of what they do. And it was at the heart of Gates. Of course, what is his overriding concern? What is the thing that keeps him up at night? The human population. And he shows in his little videos, he shows the curve. Look at the way human population is going. We need to do something. And that's what these people obsess about. You are cluttering up the planet that they want to live on. And that is every single time. That's what it goes back to with these people.
Yeah.